Right. Good morning. Welcome to our class on Revelation. Everyone's having a good day, good holiday. We are going to finish Revelation chapter 3 this morning, and then we will begin chapter 4. We might begin it this morning, but it may wait until Wednesday when hopefully I'll be back in person. At least that's the plan. So let's now begin with chapter 3. And as I mentioned last time, I want us to remember the two main points that I mentioned earlier when we started talking about this idea or this section. And that is that we are looking at these congregations, the seven churches of Asia in Revelation 2 and 3, and we're looking at them from the standpoint, practically speaking at least, of what are their challenges, what do they have to overcome, okay? And then on the other hand, what do they have to overcome? And then what is happening to them that challenges their identity? And sometimes as we've seen, it's external. They are facing threats of persecution, but in many cases, it's internal problems. And that's what we're going to see here, particularly with the congregation at Laodicea. But before we get to that, let's look at ancient Philadelphia that I mentioned. I think I started this last time. There was a huge earthquake in 17 AD that just leveled much of the city. But like so many ancient cities, it was rebuilt, and Philadelphia was rebuilt at this point because, or on the basis of the Roman emperors who helped them be exempt from giving tribute, giving payment to the Roman authorities, who of course were over the city for 5 years, and so that way that allowed them, from an economical standpoint, to get back on track. You might imagine that they would have been very grateful for such a gift, and so here we get into the concept of patron-client relationship, which I really haven't talked very much about, but that was always, I think, something that should always be something to consider when we're talking about living in the ancient Greco-Roman world. There's a Jewish population here in ancient Philadelphia. There's a Jewish population in Laodicea, and I think it's interesting to note that in some of these cases, when I've mentioned a Jewish population being present, there's no persecution. So it's not always the case, it seems, that these congregations are in conflict with the Jewish community in that particular city. That's a possibility, or it's possible that to some degree all the cities were facing persecution. And so, because as I've said before many times now, these aren't just letters given to these specific congregations. No, all the congregations could read all the letters and the rest of the book as well. So I don't think that would exclude the possibility of a place, say, like Laodicea, that would whose persecution isn't explicitly referred to, but on the other hand, maybe they were suffering persecution, but the author just doesn't mention that specifically because they've got other issues. So I don't know which it is, but I do think it's interesting that he doesn't identify that as a specific problem directly with all of these congregations. All right, well, what does he say about Philadelphia then? Well, he says in verse 7 of chapter 3 that these are the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. All right, so verse 7, this key of David idea, this is a reference to Isaiah 22. It has to do with leadership and authority and control. And of course, it's the key that belongs to David, so there's a messianic tie-in here. But it's interesting that he mentions this idea of the opening and shutting of doors. And then he says in verse 8, I know your works. Look, I've set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know you have but little power, and yet you've kept my word and have not denied my name. So what is this open door that he mentions in verse 8? Well, that phrase is used a few times in the New Testament to talk about an evangelistic opportunity. And so if this phrase is in keeping with that, then of course that's what it refers to. But Revelation doesn't mention this notion of any sort of evangelistic efforts. So this might be an exception. Maybe this just means an opportunity of some more general kind, and whatever that is, he doesn't specify it. So it could be a reference to evangelistic efforts, or it could be something else. Even, one thing we've learned, hopefully, from Revelation is this book is such a unique book that phrases and terms that are used elsewhere to signify certain things aren't necessarily used to signify that in Revelation. The way that the author describes certain scenes, for example, revelatory scenes like we see in chapter 4 and 5, have precedent elsewhere, but the way that John describes it is a little bit different. So anyway, just because it's used that way in other New Testament texts doesn't really mean a whole lot, I think, in this particular case. Whatever it is, they have an opportunity. He says, you've got a little power, and you have kept my word, you've not denied my name. So he's very positive here with the church, with the church here. And so I know you have a little power. Maybe they have a little influence. Maybe some of their members are part of the upper class, the ruling class, but that's a possibility. And so maybe that's what he means, that they have a little bit more influence than maybe some of these other congregations that he mentions in Revelation 2 and 3. I don't know for sure. All right. So now, in verse 9, we have a really interesting text here, because he says, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they're Jews and are not, but are lying. Okay, so here he does mention Jews, and it's the same, it's very similar terminology as that we've seen before, because he says they say they're Jews and they're not. The problem doesn't seem to be with the Jewish community as a whole. The problem seems to be with people who, in some sense, aren't really Jewish. Now, what does that mean exactly? And again, I'm not entirely sure, but whatever it is, that's what he is getting at. Again, this has to do with identity, not necessarily their own identity in that particular phrase, but the identity of somebody else who considers themselves Jews. But actually, he says they're not, they're lying. So what does that mean exactly? He could be referring to the fact that you have people in this particular city, this community, that thought they were Jews. They act like they're Jews, or at least they want people to think they're Jews, but they don't act like it, is what I probably should say. He says, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you, because you've kept my word of patient endurance. I will keep you from the hour of trial that's coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I'm coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. Okay, so verse 10. Now notice he doesn't really say that the people in verse 9 are persecuting them, but you could make that conclusion. But in verse 10, he seems to be talking about a larger persecution. Now, as we've said before, as I've said more than once now, the evidence for a Domitianic persecution empire-wide is very small, or non-existent, really. The only texts we have which talk about this are Christian texts written at a later time, and very frequently they're talking about it in the context of Revelation. So I think what they gathered was All right, Revelation talks about persecution. John is writing Revelation during the time of Domitian. Therefore, there must be universal persecution given by Domitian. It is a very straightforward conclusion. It's logical. I was reading something the other day that I actually missed when I was going through the introduction to Revelation. And this is Ramsey. I mentioned his book before. He says basically that if any person denies that Domitian persecuted the church on a wide scale, then, well, we can just sort of throw out history as a whole. And I think later scholars would very much take issue with his statements. I think scholarship has moved in the opposite direction since Ramsey wrote, and that's been decades now. So things change in scholarship, and so I think in that particular case, it has changed. That doesn't mean Ramsey wasn't a good scholar. He was, but I think in this particular case, we have to go with the evidence, and the evidence from contemporary sources, from archaeology, from just the sources that matter most, that are the closest to Revelation. They just don't have the evidence of persecution. But verse 10 clearly indicates that some form of persecution on a much larger scale is coming. All right, well, now what is he talking about here? And I think this is an anticipation of persecution that would happen for many communities of faith in the first century, maybe, but certainly as time moves on. So I think here we have a bit of a prediction for later times. All right, he says, I'm coming soon. Hold fast to what you have so that no one may seize your crown. All right, let's go back to this passage, or this statement. I will make them come and bow down before your feet. This is maybe an odd statement. We may think, well, what is he getting at here? Well, if you look at another passage from Isaiah, this time Isaiah chapter 60, look at what he says here. Isaiah, and then maybe we can figure out what John is doing. He says in chapter 60, verse 11, your gates will always be open, day and night they shall not be shut. Okay, gates always open. We saw the open door, so there's a similarity. But then it says, the nations will bring you their wealth. The kings led in procession, for nation and kingdom that will not serve you will perish. Those nations will be utterly laid waste. The glory of Lebanon shall come to you, the cypress, the plane, the pine, to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I will glorify where my feet rest. Verse 14, the descendants of those who oppressed you will come bending low to you, and all who despise you will bow down to your feet. They will call you the city of Yahweh, the Zion of the Holy One of Israel. Okay, if you're an ancient Israelite and you read this, how would you take it? You would take it as, well, all these nations that have persecuted us, by this time, I think that the time in which this prophecy refers, you're talking about the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, all these nations that took Israel into captivity, or at one time was over Israel. They're going to come and bow down to Israel. It's going to be a reversal. But what the book of Revelation does here is the book says actually it's the reverse. The Jews, if you go back to the text, let's see if I can go back. Yeah, there we go. If you go back to the text, it says the Jews, or at least those false Jews, they're the ones that are going to come and bow down to you. It's reversed. Jews are going to bow down to Gentiles, not Gentiles to Jews. And I think that's how it would have understood. The original audience of Isaiah 60 would have come to that conclusion, even though I think Isaiah is talking about something different. I think he's talking about the true Israel, but I don't think that would have been the case, or at least for those original readers or those original hearers of Isaiah's prophecy there. Okay, So, another very interesting intertextual move that's made there. Verse 12, if you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. You will never go out of it. I will write on you the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem that comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Okay, so this is, again, so many interesting things here, but we don't really have a whole lot of time to talk about all of them. But he says, if you conquer, okay, so what do they have to conquer? Well, they have to conquer the fact that there are Jews in the city that, or they want to be perceived as Jews, but they're really not. That's what he says. So they have to overcome that, whatever exactly that might mean. They also have to overcome an upcoming general persecution, right? So if they conquer, he says, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. So what does that mean? Why does he use that particular phrase? Well, is he talking about the literal temple in Jerusalem? No, he's not. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you will be, or they will be, but by extension, you will be, I will be, a pillar in the temple of God. It means we're going to be part of God's dwelling place, which of course points forward to Revelation 20 through 22, where that is expanded in much more detail. And of course, this idea of the New Jerusalem that comes down from God out of heaven, that's also referenced in those later chapters. And notice, and I'm going to make a bigger point out of this later, but New Jerusalem comes down from heaven, right? Everybody doesn't go up to it. The text says New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. So I think that's an interesting detail that's easy to overlook. And well, okay, maybe I could wait on this, but I think sometimes it's difficult with these latter chapters of Revelation that talk about things like this, but even here, of course, and that is to make it so metaphorical that it doesn't really mean anything, right? So, I mean, think about this. Is it literally a city coming down out of heaven? So what should we make something of the fact that New Jerusalem comes down from heaven and it doesn't say those on earth will go up to heaven? Maybe, maybe not, right? That's something that we will discuss when we get to the end of the book. All right, so now let's talk about ancient Laodicea. Laodicea is maybe of all the letters, it's maybe the one that I've heard discussed the most. If you remember at the beginning, I said we don't really talk much about Revelation generally, and what we do talk about is usually from chapters 2 and 3. Well, here we're talking about, I would say, the letter that I've heard discussed the most. And that is Laodicea. And that's because there's so many interesting things about it. So let's talk a little bit about ancient Laodicea. They had very strong ties to Rome, the Roman city. And so as you could imagine, that would mean that the emperors felt comfortable doing various things in this particular city. Like Domitian builds his temple here. Now, I don't know if you've thought about this question that I really haven't brought up, but why? So think about this. Where is the capital city of the entire Roman Empire? Well, it's the city of Rome. So why would somebody who has this capital in the city of Rome, why would he, as the emperor, want to have an important city in this part of the world, this part of the Roman Empire? Well, it's to remind people of who they're really serving, right? You constantly want that reminder. So that's why they do it. There are all kinds of other benefits. So you have the patron-client relationship that we talked about a little bit earlier. I think that's present here at Laodicea. But also, Laodicea, like other cities we've mentioned, have much revenue coming from trade. So Laodicea had a project the first century BC, so not very far before this. They had a sort of an effort to beautify the city, to make it better. There's a huge theater that was built toward the end of the first century as well, and so there's a certain affluence here with this city. But as I've said before, a lot of the times in Revelation 2 and 3, and remember I talked about this a couple of classes ago about methodology, and I said that sometimes what has happened with some scholars is they want to make this book reflect the very specific details of the cities themselves. And I think that's where Laodicea, or that's how Laodicea has been interpreted very frequently. And so, again, I want us to be careful. Okay, we might think, well, we don't really have to get all this right to understand it and apply it. And I would say I understand that point of view, but at the same time, this is Scripture. And so I think it's worth our efforts to try to understand it as best we can. Maybe that means that we don't go with what we've heard many, many times. Sometimes it does, right? It's whatever fits the evidence the best. I couldn't decide where I was going to say most or best. So little off tonight. It's tonight where I am. It's in the morning where you are. Anyway, it's what fits the evidence the best. The evidence from the text itself, but also external evidence. Okay, so let's remember that sort of methodological point as we get started here. All right, so Jesus says, I know your works. You're neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either cold or hot. But because you're lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. Some translations say vomit, which is an even stronger depiction of what's happening here. He says, you say, I'm rich, I've prospered, I need nothing. You do not realize you're wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. He says, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire so that you may be rich, white robes to clothe you, to keep the shame of your nakedness from being seen, and salve to anoint your eyes that you may see. I reprove and discipline those whom I love. Be earnest, therefore, and repent. Listen, I'm standing at the door knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come into you and eat with you, and you with me. To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, as myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. All right, and so there again in verse 22, at the end of this section, he says, let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches, plural, right? So here again is a reminder that he's not just writing to the Laodiceans, he's writing to everybody. So, verse 15, he says, I know your works, you're neither cold nor hot. And so he mentions this notion of temperature, and then verse 20, he says, I will come with you, I will come into you and eat with you, all right? So there is this motif, I think, that emerges in this section of the text about meals. And that's very different than what you've heard. I would imagine many of you have probably heard that this cold and hot refers to the water supply to Laodicea. The water supply was cold and hot water, and so some have gone further and they said, well, there was a problem with the water supply at Laodicea, and so they couldn't really get cold water, they couldn't get hot water, and that's what Jesus is talking about. Well, again, that's something that's been repeated so many times that a lot of times when something's repeated so many times, people just don't even question it. They don't question the original person, the first person who actually made the claim. And if they did trace it back to that, then they don't look at where they got this information from. A lot of times it happens that it's just repeated so many times, nobody ever really questions, well, where do we get that idea? Well, I think it's important to ask it here. Where do we get that idea? Is that something that the ancient sources bear out? Because it's been repeated so many times that I think it would be easy to conclude the ancient sources must be absolutely clear that that is the problem, and therefore what Jesus is saying, we can understand it within that framework. The evidence doesn't suggest that that's the problem. There were many cities in Asia Minor, in the Roman Empire generally, that had water supplies. Okay? So to single Laodicea out in this way is a bit strange because these other cities had water supplies, all right? So then what people do is they extrapolate. They say, okay, well, he mentions the water supply because they had a problem with it. But there are ancient sources dating from the first century and around the same time that say the opposite. Laodicea, you could say, is known to have good quality water. So that doesn't really work. Okay, the imagery just won't work for that purpose. The evidence doesn't allow it. Okay, we can keep saying it, but when the evidence doesn't support it, I don't think we need to. One commentary that I looked at suggested that the background here is again a meal, and that is explicitly stated in verse 20. And you may think, well, what does this water imagery have to do with it in verse 16, or this, not being cold or hot, but being lukewarm? What is that talking about? Well, so archaeology has helped in this regard. On the left is a strainer, and what this was used for was to cool a drink, right? So if you had a guest coming over and it's very hot, as it could get, of course, in certain parts of the Roman Empire, like Israel, for example, you might want to chill that drink somehow, right? And so the way that you would do this is you would use a strainer like that. Okay. Well, on the other hand, on the right side of this is a heater, and this would heat a drink. Okay, it's cold outside. Well, you want to heat this, and so you put maybe it over a fire. It heats up the drink, and that's what you would serve to your guests. Normally, this would be used for water, and so you heat the water. You mix it with wine, which is a very common drink of hospitality, and that's what you would do. So if you were a good host, you would figure out which situation demanded heating or cooling of the drink, and that would be the way to serve your guest. But that's not what the Laodiceans do, apparently. And so what he's doing is he's using this metaphor of bad hospitality, really, to talk about, of course, and this is the part that's not controversial, right? It's what is the purpose of this imagery, and it's to show that they are in the middle. They're not warm, meaning they're not faithful, apparently. They're not doing things that they need to be doing or having the right motivation. But on the other hand, they haven't just completely given up. They're sort of in the middle. And so what he's saying is, that's how you are, and it basically, he says, it makes me sick, right? Again, if you're drinking water that's lukewarm, it's not very good, okay? If you're and so, that's the point. This sort of attitude disgusts Jesus. And the other problem, of course, is perception. They perceive that they're rich. And I think when he says, I'm rich here to talk about this congregation, he probably means maybe not financially so, but he means that they are rich in the sense that they feel like they're spiritually rich. We're doing okay. And they say, we need nothing. We're in good shape. We would say today they are a faithful and sound congregation. That's how they viewed themselves. And he says, actually, though, you're wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. So they got a lot of problems, right? So he says pitiable. Maybe he says this because they think they're a certain way, but they're really not. And so here we get into a discussion we've talked about before in Revelation. I think it was Revelation 2. We talked about this notion of perception and reality. And what matters is not how we perceive our own spiritual success, but how does God perceive it? How does he see it? Because that's reality. And so he says the reality is you're all these negative things. He says you're blind, right? Well, verse 18, he says you need to come to me to get the things to make you what you need to be, including salve to anoint your eyes that you may see. Now, again, some scholars in years past, in particular, have said, well, there was a medical school very close to Laodicea. I think it's 13 miles away or something like that. And so they were specializing in eye salve. Well, again, there's no evidence for that. This is a very common thing to have in many Roman cities. So it's referring to something that the original audience would have known about locally, but it's nothing special to Laodicea. It doesn't seem like. But the point he wishes to make is you need to buy from me some salve so you can see. He says they're blind. And then he says they're naked. Remember, in the book of Revelation, nakedness is not viewed as something admirable as it was in Greco-Roman culture, right? There's so many statues, art depictions of gods and heroes and other citizens, Roman emperors, for example, who are naked or close to it. It was a sense of pride and honor. Well, it's not in Revelation, and it's not here. Nakedness here clearly has to do with shame, as he mentions in verse 18. He says, you need to buy from me gold refined that you may be rich. Is he talking about literal gold? No, of course not. What does he mean? I think he probably means you need to come to me and get your faith back, maybe is the way we would put it. He says, you also need white robes. You are unholy. And then again, salve to anoint your eyes that you may see. Again, he's talking about perception. And this is, I think, really the more practical question maybe that we could ask about this, is how do we know where we are as a congregation? How do we know? Do we ask other people in the congregation, what do you think about our congregation? Right? Well, maybe. And I don't know that would be a bad practice necessarily. Okay, so we could do that. But the other thing that I've mentioned before is we could also take stock of ourselves, right? So how can we, as individuals in a congregation made up of a lot of individuals, how are we perceived by ourselves in comparison to reality? And so that's the other question that I think we could ask. But really, ultimately, we constantly have to ask the question, what am I doing and why am I doing it? And I think if we do that as individuals, if we do that as a congregation, we won't be blind. We won't be misled. This notion of blindness and spirituality probably reminds some of us of John chapter 9, where the Pharisees were spiritually blind, right? Same thing here with this congregation. But then in verse 19, and this I think is so powerful, and I think I've mentioned this before about the congregation at Corinth. Right? Paul writes to them about so many problems. And of course, he's inspired by God. And so really, this is how God sees the Corinthians. And, I think I said this before, but if it were me, I just don't know about them. Okay. I mean, I really don't. I think maybe I would have given up on them. But God doesn't do that. Paul doesn't do that. And Jesus doesn't do that with the Laodiceans here. He says, I reprove and discipline those whom I love. So the things he says about them are shocking. The imagery of spitting water or whatever out, a lukewarm liquid out of your mouth is disgusting. He calls them blind and pitiable, etc. But he does that because he wants them to wake up. And ultimately he says, I'm disciplining you because I love you. Right? And he says, be earnest, therefore, and repent. I'm here waiting on you to make the right decision. And if you do, if you let me in, then I will come and eat with you. And there are a lot of interpretations about exactly what he means when he says, I will come eat with you. Is this the Messianic banquet that we talked about before? Is this the Lord's Supper? I don't know. I don't know what it is exactly, but it means that we can have fellowship. I think whatever exactly that means, we can have fellowship again. And of course, that's what he wants. That's what he wants from this congregation. All right, so now let's go to Revelation chapter 4. Now let's see if this works. Should work. All right, so that's Revelation 2 and 3. So again, as we think about those chapters that we know probably pretty well, let's remember their relationship to these other chapters, because now we are really starting the book. Chapters 2 and 3 contain themes that we're going to see again, of course, but it's on a different scale. And I would say the genre of Revelation changes here. Okay, remember I said it's an apocalypse, but that can mean different things and has meant different things to different people. But here we really get into the more apocalyptic elements. But some of the motifs that we've seen before that are present are present throughout this entire section. And that is, for example, the way that the author uses the Old Testament. In chapters 4 and 5, there's so many things going on, and it's so interesting to try to put ourselves in his position, which in a lot of ways is not possible, but we can try, and I think that's what the author wants us to do. We ought to try to put ourselves in his position. He's trying to describe it, right? And so in all that, we might lose some of the things that are happening literarily, but since it's a text and it's not, some sort of projection where we can actually see what he saw, then I think it becomes imperative that we try to figure out what is happening at a literary level, as we, at the same time, we try to figure out what this would have been like to see it as he did. All right, so the other thing to remember is this isn't just Revelation 4 and 5. This is Revelation 4 through the rest of the book, really. So that's why I say this is where it actually begins, but this is also where some of the more difficult issues structurally begin, particularly with chapter 6, but I think 4 and 5 and how we view it can help us with the rest of the book. So I want us to take our time with 4 and 5, but not too much time, because we still have a lot, of course, to go through. All right. So with Revelation 4, what we have here is, in terms of genre, and this is 4 and 5, it's a heavenly ascent. And what that means is John goes up to heaven, and he sees this scene of just awe and wonder at the one sitting on the throne, but also what's happening around him. Now, in terms of heavenly ascent, we've got two texts in the New Testament, which I think are to be described in this way in the first person. So Revelation 4 and 2 Corinthians 12. I think 2 Corinthians 12, something else is going on there, but we don't have to go into that right now. But we want to know what he saw. That's why I've got here on the left something from the from that graphic novel that I mentioned before. These are the four living creatures that we will meet in just a little bit. We want to know what that looked like. I do, just because it's so interesting visually. If this is anything like it, I mean, can you imagine seeing? I've never seen anything like this, even though they're like animals and people, right? We're familiar with these beings on Earth, but not like this. right? So we want to know what this looks like. And I understand that, and I must be honest with myself. I want that too. But here's what I really think we ought to try to focus on, especially when we're not entirely sure, or we can't be entirely sure what he's seeing exactly. And that is, why is he being shown these particular images in this way, right? Because I think there is a certain way God has shown him this vision, and it could have been otherwise. Okay? I mean, just theoretically, it could have been otherwise. But this is the way God chose to reveal this particular vision to John. So then I think our job as interpreters should be, why? Why is he choosing this particular symbol? For example, in chapter 5, he refers to Jesus as a lamb having been slain. What other ways could Jesus have been shown to John in this vision? We can think of a lot of different ways. We can think of how he's pictured in chapter 1 of the same book. That's not how he's pictured in chapter 5. So it's worth asking, why are these beings in this realm described in the way that it is? And ultimately, what we want to know is, what does John learn from this heavenly ascent? What information does he get? And how does John and how do we use that information with the rest of the book? That's really, I think, what we ought to try to focus on here in 4 and 5. But as I said, we can't help but be captivated by the imagery. And what he sees here, by the way, I think that Revelation graphic novel, I think, for an artist, he or she could really do something with some of these scenes in the book of Revelation. Because if you go on Google Images, which is what I did, and I typed in Revelation 4, I don't know who this is, I don't know the origin of this image, but this image was very common, and I think it does a reasonably good job. You see in this picture, you got the creatures there, you have the 24 elders, and then you have the myriads of angels around it. You got the color of the one sitting on the throne. You can't really see the rainbow at all, so that maybe there's something to be improved upon, or at least I can't. Maybe I'm just not seeing it very well. I'm not creative enough, maybe. And that's what I say. I think someone who is creative, I'm not, but somebody who is, could really do something with these images. Of course, trying to be true to the text, but at the same time, captured in a way that, to my knowledge, not in any popular way has been captured other than that comic book or that graphic novel. So what does John see then? Well, I think that what this particular image captures is that John sees things. Using things is a little bit mentally lazy sometimes, but I'm not sure how else to describe this. So what he sees are objects and beings in concentric circles around the throne. He sees the rainbow. He sees the 4 cherubim. They're the living creatures, but I think we can understand them to be cherubim. And then you see the 24 elders, and then the great number of angels. So it's just, like I said, this concentric circle that continually goes outward. So then we have this door in heaven, and it's open to him, right? And this fits, by the way, very well with what Jesus said to the Laodiceans. What does he tell them? There's an open door before you. John sees an open door, right? That's a very interesting connection there. Okay, so he says the first voice. Now, I think this is a reference back to chapter 1. And so the first voice is not Jesus, who was speaking at the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2 and 3. I think he's saying this is a different voice. I think that's what he's trying to what he's trying to get across here. He says, "Come up here. I will show you what must soon, or what might not soon, what must take place after this." Okay, it says, "At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne with one seated on the throne." All right, so this is the last thing I'll say for this morning's class. But here again, we have God described as sitting on the throne. He's seated on the throne. And I asked this question before. What does that mean? Like, why, again, if we were trying to answer the question, why does John, or rather, why does God choose to show John this image of himself? And I think that's to get across the idea that he's in control. He has the power. And so that is the theme that we should take throughout Revelation, right? God wins, and anything else that we might think can equal him absolutely cannot. And so the very first thing he really sees here is this throne. And that's what matters. And speaking of how this relates to the rest of the book, whatever we make of these events, whatever we make of the order and all those sorts of things, the details, what matters is God is in control of all of them. He's the one who is making all this, or from their perspective, will make all these things happen. Why? He's the one sitting on the throne. It's not the emperor. It's not the local officials. It's not the Jews who may be oppressing that congregation. It's God himself who's sitting on the throne. All right, so hopefully that was a decent introduction to chapter 4, and we'll get into the details on Wednesday. See you then. Take care.